Many Christians are surprised to find out how ordinary the Bible's origins are. The Bible doesn't really have a flashy origin story like some religious texts do. There's no involvement of angels or golden tablets or really any kind of touch of the supernatural. It's very much an ordinary origin story for the biblical text, which actually kind of is in keeping a little bit with the biblical story, and God taking this ordinary thing and doing something extraordinary with it. That typically is the way we believe God works with humanity as well. But really, it's a very ordinary process. The typical stages of composition of the biblical text are pretty typical for how any text might come together. First, something happens. The call of the disciples, the crucifixion, the destruction of Jerusalem. Something happens. And when something happens, people start talking about it. There's a period of oral transmission of the text. Now, with our Western enlightened sensibilities, very often we think of this oral period of transmission as a little more fluid and not quite as reliable as the written. In truth, the oral transmission period can be as reliable as the written period of the text. We just aren't, in our culture, very good auditors. We don't listen very well. We wouldn't transmit the stories very well. But in some cultures they are. A friend of mine actually took a trip to Bhutan and met a number of storytellers there and was surprised to see that these storytellers could tell another storyteller's story once they'd heard it one time. They only had to hear it one time and they could tell that story accurately. And it was amazing, and just again a reflection of how our culture very good at visual, and you know, we're very good at the visual. If you go to any summer blockbuster movie, you can see we emphasize the visual, but we're rather poor auditors. Not every culture is like that. So I don't want us to run down that oral period like sometimes we have a tendency to do in our culture. That oral period of transmission could be a long period of time. In the case of some Old Testament stories, maybe as much as 1,000 years before a text actually has pen put to paper. In the case of the New Testament, probably a much shorter period, as little as a generation after Jesus, do you get those stories start to get written down. But something begins to motivate the writing of these fragments, maybe first, and then you collect those fragments together, and then pretty soon those collections of fragments are edited together by a professional editor who will come in and add introductions and transitions and conclusions so that we can talk about books. And we start gathering those books together, and we have the Torah books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy kept together, and the histories, you know, Judges and Joshua and Samuel and Kings. But we also have Enoch and the Prayer of Manasseh and First Maccabees and Bel and the Dragon. And then I hear you say, wait a minute, I don't have those books in my Old Testament, Dr. Wallace. Well, you don't if you were raised in a Protestant tradition like myself. And that's because I haven't gotten to the very last stage of the process of how the Bible came to be, and that is the most important stage, really, and that is this canonization. Canonization is when a text is described as authoritative, as important. A canon with one N, a canon with two N's is a really big gun. A canon with one N is a list of books that have been recognized to be authoritative for faith and practice. So a group has said, yes, these are books that we need to be reading versus these are books that we shouldn't be reading. And different religious groups have different canons. In the case of our biblical text, the Jewish biblical canon is just the 39 books we call Old Testament, from Genesis to Malachi, although in the Jewish canon they run from Genesis to 2nd Chronicles. That won't be important right now. The Protestant canon has the 39 books we call Old Testament, but also has the 27 books that we think of as New Testament, from Matthew all the way to Revelation. The Catholic biblical canon has the 39 Old Testament books, the 27 New Testament books, and then 7 what are called deuterocanonical or apocryphal books. Those books we'll talk more about, but they are written in between the traditional close of the Old Testament and beginning of the New Testament. So their canon is a little bit bigger. These books are official in Catholic tradition. So it's different Bibles as we go along the way. So who makes these decisions? Who says what's official and what's not official? Well, luckily that's the topic of another video.